My name is Emma Mason. I'm 34 years old, and this story happened last summer after a devastating accident on a school field trip where one of my students drowned. I've carried a crushing weight of guilt. The world called it an accident, but in my heart, I couldn't let it go. I needed space, time to think and heal, or so I thought. That's why I took my RV to Yellow Smoke Park in Denison, Iowa. I told myself the trip was about peace and closure. I'd hike, write in my journal, and maybe find some kind of forgiveness. But Yellow Smoke had other plans for me. I arrived on a warm June morning. The lake sparkled under the sun, and the woods around the campground buzzed with life. It looked idyllic, exactly the kind of place I'd imagined. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, close enough to hear the water lapping against the shore, but far enough from the main camping area to feel the solitude I craved. The first day was uneventful. I walked the trails, snapping photos of birds and wildflowers, and returned to my RV just as the sun began to set. That's when I heard it for the first time. Faint laughter, high-pitched and joyful, coming from the direction of the lake. I smiled despite myself. It was nice to hear kids playing, a reminder of the good moments I'd had with my students before the accident. But as I peered out the window, something felt off. The campground was quiet, and I hadn't seen any families nearby. Yet near the water's edge, I saw a little girl. She was playing alone, her pale dress swaying in the breeze. "Hey, sweetie," I called, stepping out of the RV. "Where are your parents?" The girl froze. Slowly, she turned to look at me. Her face was blank, expressionless. My stomach twisted. She pointed toward the lake, then turned and ran toward the water, disappearing into the mist. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe her parents were just out of sight, or maybe I was tired from the long drive. That night, I wrote about her in my journal, describing her pale dress and the odd, hollow look in her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. I woke around 2 a.m. to the sound of faint knocking. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard it again, deliberate, rhythmic, and coming from the door of my RV. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. The knocking stopped. But as I shone the beam of light across the foggy campground, I saw them. Small, muddy handprints streaked across the side of my RV. I slammed the curtain shut and spent the rest of the night clutching my flashlight, listening to whispers that seemed to float on the breeze. The next day, I tried to distract myself with another hike. The woods were dense and lush, the air cool beneath the canopy of leaves. I told myself that what had happened the night before was just my imagination. That's when I saw her again, the little girl. She was standing at the edge of the trail, watching me. "Hi," I said cautiously, stepping closer. She tilted her head. "Do you want to play?" The question sent a shiver down my spine, but I forced a smile. "Where are your parents?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started walking deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed her. We emerged into a clearing where an old rusted playground stood. Swings creaked in the breeze, and a decayed slide leaned precariously to one side. Carved into the wood of a splintered seesaw were names, dozens of them. Some faded, some fresh. "What is this place?" I asked. But the girl was gone. I returned to my RV, shaken. That evening, I drove into town to pick up some supplies and couldn't resist asking the cashier about the playground. "You found that old thing?" she said, her face pale. "No one's used it in years." "Why not?" She hesitated, then leaned in. "Because it's cursed. Everyone knows that. Kids drown in that lake, and their spirits linger. They say they're looking for playmates." I forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. "Ghost stories." "You believe what you want," she said, her tone serious. I drove back to the campground with a heavy heart, the weight of the stories pressing against my chest. That night, the little girl came to my RV door. I heard her faint voice calling, "Emma, come outside. We can play now." My blood ran cold. I hadn't told her my name. I stayed frozen in my seat, clutching my flashlight, as the knocking began again, this time more insistent. When I finally worked up the courage to look out the window, I saw not just her, but a group of children. Their faces were pale, and their eyes dark. They surrounded the RV, their small hands leaving streaks of mud across the windows. "Come play with us," they chanted. their voices overlapping in an eerie melody. I screamed, grabbing my journal and clutching it to my chest. The next morning, I resolved to end it. I hiked back to the playground, determined to face whatever was haunting me. The air was thick with tension, the woods unnervingly silent. When I reached the clearing, the children were waiting. Maggie, as I'd come to call the little girl, stood at the center. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were filled with sadness. "You let us down," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "It was an accident." The other children began to move closer, their pale forms flickering like static. "You let her drown," Maggie said, her tone turning accusing. "I know," I sobbed. "I know I failed. I'm sorry." The children paused, their movements stilling as my words echoed in the clearing. "I'm sorry," I said again, louder this time. "I'm sorry I couldn't save her. I'm sorry I wasn't enough." The children stared at me for a long moment, then began to fade, one by one, until only Maggie remained. "Thank you for playing with us," she said, her voice almost kind. Then she too disappeared. The park was quiet when I returned to my RV. The handprints were gone, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. I left a bouquet of wildflowers by the lake before I drove away, a small token of my regret and hope for forgiveness. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw Maggie standing by the water, her pale dress swaying in the breeze. She raised a hand in farewell, and for the first time, I felt a sliver of peace. That night, when I opened my journal, I found a new entry written in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for playing with us. We forgive you." My name is Camila Lopez, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022, during what was supposed to be a peaceful getaway to reconnect with my younger brother Liam, who had just turned 27. I don't know if writing this will make it any easier to believe, but it's all I can do now. There are nights I wake up hearing that sound again, that awful, hollow mimicry of my own voice calling out from the woods. It began as Liam's idea. He'd been bugging me for months to take a trip together, just the two of us, like we used to when we were kids. He had a knack for convincing me to humor his wild ideas, so I agreed to a weekend at Split Rock Lighthouse State Park in Minnesota. It was supposed to be simple: a rented RV, a few hikes, and some much-needed sibling bonding. We brought Liam's friend Eric along, though I'd only met him a couple of times, a quiet, broad-shouldered guy in his early 30s who didn't say much but seemed decent enough. Liam swore he was chill and a good buffer for when things got tense between us. The first day passed uneventfully. We parked the RV in a designated spot near the main trails. The plan was to hike, stargaze, and unwind. But of course, Liam couldn't leave well enough alone. That night, as we sat around the fire, he brought up the legend of Raven's Cradle. It was an off-limits area near the cliffs, he explained, where people claimed to see skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Navajo lore. "You're being ridiculous," I said, rolling my eyes. "Skinwalkers aren't even part of Minnesota's history. That's a Southwest thing." "Maybe," Liam shot back, grinning. "But legends spread. Who's to say there isn't something similar here?" Eric just stared into the flames, his jaw tight. I didn't think much of it at the time. "Let's hike there tomorrow," Liam pressed. "Come on, Camila, it'll be fun." I wanted to argue, but his excitement reminded me of when we were kids, sneaking into places we shouldn't. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The next morning, we set out. The trail to Raven's Cradle wasn't marked, but Liam had read about it on some amateur folklore blog. We veered off the main path, pushing through dense underbrush. I felt the tension early, a strange prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like we were being watched. "Do you hear that?" Eric asked suddenly, stopping mid-step. We all froze. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. I shrugged it off, trying to lighten the mood. "Nature's shy," I said, forcing a laugh. Liam didn't respond. He kept walking, his usual bravado muted. The farther we went, the harder it became to ignore the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. About an hour into the hike, Eric pointed at the ground. "What the hell is that?" The dirt path was marked with strange prints, large, clawed impressions that looked almost human, but wrong. Liam knelt to inspect them, his face lighting up with excitement. "See? I told you! Skinwalker tracks!" "Oh, give me a break!" I snapped. "It's probably just a bear." Eric didn't look convinced, and truth be told, neither was I. We reached Raven's Cradle by late afternoon. It was breathtaking, a jagged cliff overlooking Lake Superior, the waves crashing far below. But the beauty couldn't shake the unease that had been building since the hike began. As we set up a small camp to rest, I thought I heard something. My own voice, faint and distorted, echoing from the woods. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. "Did you?" I started, but stopped myself. Liam was busy taking pictures, and Eric looked lost in thought. That night, the first real horror began. We were gathered around a fire outside the RV when Liam froze mid-sentence, staring into the trees. "Did you hear that?" I didn't respond. I'd heard it too, a soft, high-pitched laugh followed by a rustling sound. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam seemed swallowed by the night. "Probably a raccoon," I muttered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Yeah, a raccoon that laughs," Eric said dryly. His calm demeanor was cracking. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl. Liam grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it like a weapon. The next few hours were a blur of terror. Something or someone was stalking us. We saw glimpses of it between the trees, a figure that shifted and twisted, its form flickering between animal and human. When I caught a full glimpse of it, I froze in disbelief. It had Liam's face. Not quite, though. It was an uncanny, distorted version, its eyes too large, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. My breath hitched as it mimicked his voice perfectly. "Camila, come here. Come closer." I screamed, backing away, and the thing disappeared into the woods, leaving only the echo of its voice. Back at the RV, we locked ourselves inside, our panic mounting. The generator sputtered out, plunging us into darkness. Scratching sounds started on the walls, followed by heavy thuds on the roof. The creature wasn't just stalking us anymore. It was playing with us. Eric tried to keep us calm, but even he was on edge. "We need to stay inside. It can't get in if we—" A loud crash cut him off. The back window shattered, and a long, clawed arm reached inside. Eric grabbed a knife from the counter and slashed at it, forcing it to retreat. But we knew we couldn't stay there much longer. At dawn, we decided to make a run for it. With the RV no longer safe, we packed what little we could carry and headed toward the main road. The hike back was a nightmare. The creature followed us, its mimicry growing more unsettling. It called out in Eric's voice now, pleading and screaming for help. We tried to ignore it, but the forest seemed to conspire against us. The trails looped back on themselves, leading us in circles. I felt despair creeping in, but Liam grabbed my arm, his face pale but determined. "We can't let it win," he whispered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the skinwalker made its move. It appeared directly in our path, its form more grotesque than ever. This time, it took on Eric's appearance, but its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Eric, the real Eric, stepped forward with the knife. "Go. I'll hold it off." "No," I screamed, but he didn't listen. He charged the creature, his bravery both foolish and heroic. The last thing I saw before Liam pulled me away was Eric's body collapsing as the creature's claws tore into him. Liam remembered something he'd read about skinwalkers, that invoking their true name could weaken them. In desperation, he recited a Navajo chant he'd memorized for his blog. Though it was incomplete, the creature faltered, its form flickering like a dying flame. We seized the moment, running until we broke free of the forest and onto the main road, where a passing car stopped to help. Eric was gone, and the guilt still eats at me. I haven't been back to Split Rock since. Sometimes, late at night, I hear it again, the voice calling my name from the woods. If you ever find yourself in those forests, don't listen. And for God's sake, don't follow the voices. My name is Jack Whitman. I'm 42 years old, and last spring I set out on an RV road trip across the Midwest. After my divorce and losing my job, I felt like I needed to get away. from the noise of the city, and frankly from myself. I wanted solitude, time to think, and maybe a little peace. What I found at Pikes Peak State Park in Iowa was something else entirely, something I can't explain even now. It started like any other stop on my trip. I pulled my beat-up RV into the small campground on a misty April morning. The park was quiet, with only a few other campers scattered around, their tents barely visible through the fog rolling off the Mississippi River. It was perfect, isolated, but not desolate. After parking near a trail that led to the bluff, I stepped out to take in the view. The cliffs loomed high above the water, the kind of place that felt timeless, ancient. The fog clung to the edges, blurring the line between land and sky. It was beautiful, sure, but there was something else about it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The first day was uneventful. I hiked a few trails, snapped some photos of the river, and scribbled a few half-hearted journal entries in the evening. Writing had always been my outlet, even back when I was a journalist. Now, it was more of a lifeline. Something to keep me grounded when the weight of my regrets threatened to crush me. That night, I cooked dinner over a camp stove and settled in to read. The fog was thicker than before, swirling outside the RV windows like smoke. The quiet was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midnight, I heard something. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was a voice, faint and indistinct, carried on the breeze. "Jack," it whispered. I bolted upright. It was distant, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. My name. Jack. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. The fog swallowed the beam of light almost immediately, reducing visibility to a few feet. My pulse thundered in my ears. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jack." I backed toward the RV, my heart pounding. The voice didn't sound threatening, but it didn't sound right either. It had a hollow, echoing quality, like it was coming from a broken radio. I shut the door and locked it, refusing to go back outside. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe the stress of the last few months was finally catching up with me. I forced myself to focus on the day's plans. More hiking, more writing, anything to distract me. As I walked along one of the trails near the bluff, I came across another camper. She was sitting on a fallen log, staring out at the river. "Morning," I said, giving her a nod. She turned to look at me, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't go near the bluff after dark," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a strange intensity in her eyes. I frowned. "Why is that?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "People say it's haunted." "Haunted?" I couldn't help but chuckle. She didn't smile. "There's something out there, something old. It doesn't like to be disturbed." I thought about the voice I'd heard the night before, but didn't say anything. Instead, I just nodded and kept walking, brushing her off as a superstitious local. That night, the voice returned. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, writing in my journal, when I heard it again. "Jack." It was louder this time, clearer. My pen slipped from my hand, leaving a jagged line across the page. "Jack, come outside." My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't just calling my name. It was inviting me. Against my better judgment, I stepped to the window and peered out. The fog was even thicker than the night before, and I could barely make out the shapes of the trees. But then, in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the bluff. It was tall and shadowy, its outline blurry in the mist. I stumbled back from the window, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Come outside," the voice repeated, louder now. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping onto the damp ground. My hands trembled as I pointed the beam of light toward the bluff, but the figure was gone. The whispers continued, growing fainter, as if retreating into the woods. The next morning, I found my journal pages filled with words I didn't remember writing. "This is your fault. You can't run. He's waiting." The words were scrawled in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing them. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, each one more disturbing than the last. That afternoon, I ran into the camper again, the woman who had warned me about the bluff. "Something's out there," I said, my voice low. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "It always finds the broken ones," she said. I wanted to ask what she meant, but she turned and walked away before I could. That night, I couldn't stay in the RV. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bluff, determined to prove to myself that there was nothing out there. The fog wrapped around me as I approached the edge, the sound of the river below muffled and distant. I stopped when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the bluff, his back to me. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. "Jack," he said, his voice smooth and deep. I froze. The figure turned, and I saw his face, or rather, the lack of it. His features were indistinct, like a smear on a canvas, but his eyes glowed faintly red. "I know what you want," he said. "I can give it to you." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "All your pain, all your guilt, it can be gone. You just have to say yes." He extended a hand, long and pale, his fingers unnaturally thin. I took a step back, shaking my head. The devil smiled. "Think about it, Jack. No more regret, no more loneliness, no more failure." Images flashed through my mind. My ex-wife's angry face, the newsroom where I'd been fired, the empty apartment I'd left behind. "No," I whispered. His smile faded. "Are you sure?" I turned and ran. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The whispers followed me the whole way, louder and more insistent, but I didn't look back. By the time I reached the RV, the fog had begun to lift, and the forest was eerily quiet. I left the park at dawn, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing at the edge of the bluff, watching me go. And I swear he was smiling. My name's Kay Reiner, and I've been a cop in Ravensshore, Wyoming for the better part of, well, I'm not counting anymore. Small town, small problems, right? Mostly traffic stops, the occasional domestic dispute, and once in a while a bar brawl that leaves the place smelling like old whiskey and bad decisions. Nothing I can't handle. People around here know me as the guy who can crack a joke, diffuse a situation, and still make it to Sunday dinner with my folks. But last Tuesday, that was different. It was 2012, the kind of quiet day where I was mostly concerned with who's parking their truck too close to the fire hydrant or who's double dipping on permits for the fall hunting season. I'd just gotten back from grabbing coffee at Merle's Diner, the only spot in town with passable coffee, when dispatch called in a missing persons report. A family of tourists hadn't checked out of their rented cabin by the lake. The owner, an old guy named Earl Patterson, had tried to get in touch with them after they were 2 hours late. No answer. Most times it's a mix-up. People think checkout is at noon when it's actually 10 a.m. But Earl was jittery on the phone. I could hear him breathing heavy. Earl's usually laid back, grumbles a lot, but never nervous. I figured I'd take a drive up there to see what was going on. Ravenshore's got a lake, sure, but we're not exactly a tourist trap. Anyone from out of town stands out. The cabin itself is about 15 miles into the woods, isolated and quiet. It's the kind of place people rent when they want to forget the world exists for a weekend. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find something no one was going to believe. The drive up was uneventful. The sky had this overcast thing going on, and the wind was whipping through the trees, giving the woods an eerie vibe. I wasn't thinking much of it. Just another day in a small-town cop's life, I figured. When I pulled up to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door was ajar. Not wide open, but not locked either. I stepped out of my cruiser, hand on my belt, and made my way to the porch. "Anyone home?" I called, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. It smelled wrong, like the place hadn't been aired out in weeks. There was something else, too. Something that made my skin crawl, but I couldn't place it right away. The cabin was empty. No bags, no sign of life. I made my way through the kitchen and glanced at the half-eaten sandwiches on the table. Looked like someone had been in the middle of lunch when they decided to drop everything and walk out. Not normal, but not enough to start sounding alarms. And then I saw it. In the living room, There was a trail of mud, if it was mud, leading to the back door. I followed it, noticing how the prints seemed too large, too irregular. They didn't look like boots or bare feet. No, it was something else entirely. Something animal, maybe. Out back, the forest seemed darker than it should be for midday. Dense, looming trees stretched toward the sky, casting long shadows over the ground. I followed the prints. They led into the woods. After about 50 yards, I found something I wasn't expecting. Blood, a lot of it. Splattered across the pine needles, smeared across the rocks. But no bodies. Jesus, I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. My stomach churned, but I kept it together. Whatever had happened here, it was bad. Real bad. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound from deeper in the woods. Not quite a growl, but enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't armed with anything more than my service pistol, and let's just say I wasn't feeling confident that 6 rounds were going to cut it. Still, I pressed on. Maybe it was stupid. Maybe I should have called for backup. But out here, backup was at least 30 minutes away, and I wasn't about to let whatever was out there get too far ahead. The deeper I went into the woods, the stranger things got. Broken branches, tufts of fur snagged on bark. More of that reddish-brown smear leading me forward. I wasn't an expert tracker by any means, but this was all wrong. Nothing about this trail made sense. It was erratic, zigzagging, doubling back on itself, like whatever left it was either playing with its prey or wasn't thinking like a normal predator. That's when I found the first body, or what was left of it. The torso was mangled beyond recognition, clothes shredded, the limbs missing. Whoever it had been, they weren't just dead, they'd been torn apart. And whatever did it hadn't bothered with eating the body. It was just destruction. Pure, brutal destruction. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. There was a rustling in the trees behind me, a movement that didn't match the wind. I turned, slow, my heart thudding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That's when I saw it, just for a split second, something huge, hunched over, crouching low to the ground, covered in matted fur. Its limbs were long and wrong, too many joints, too many angles. It vanished into the underbrush before I could even blink. I froze, gun drawn but useless. My mind raced. What the hell was I dealing with? A bear? No, bears don't tear people apart like that. Wolves, maybe? But wolves don't leave half-eaten bodies in the open. This was something else entirely, something worse. I decided then that it was time to go. Whatever had killed that family was still out here, and I wasn't equipped to deal with it. But as I turned to head back toward the cabin, I heard a snap, a twig breaking underfoot. I wasn't alone. I barely had time to react. The thing lunged out from behind a tree, fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be. I fired off 2 shots, more out of reflex than anything else. One hit it, but it didn't stop. I felt a sharp pain in my side as I was knocked to the ground, my gun flying from my hand. This thing was on top of me, snarling, its hot breath against my neck. I could feel its claws digging into my side, tearing at my uniform. I kicked, punched, did anything I could to get it off me, but it was like fighting a force of nature. Then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it was gone, disappearing back into the woods as if it had never been there. I lay there, gasping for air, my side bleeding, my mind racing. What the hell had just happened? I don't remember how I got back to my cruiser. Adrenaline, probably. Maybe shock. By the time I made it back to town, I was pale, bleeding, and shaking like a leaf in the wind. I told the chief everything. Well, most of it. You can't just walk in and say a damn monster tried to rip you in half. But I showed him the blood, the wounds, and I told him about the family. We went back up there, of course, me, the chief, and 2 deputies. The bodies were still there. So was the blood. But that thing, it was gone. Vanished into the woods like a ghost. We searched for hours, called in wildlife experts. Hell, even the feds showed up. But they didn't find anything. The official report said it was a bear attack. You and I both know that's bull. Now, I'm not saying I know what I saw because I don't. But whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere in the woods. My name's Samuel Neven. And back in 2004, I was working as a search and rescue officer in the Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. I didn't grow up around here, though. I came from Indiana, a flat, uneventful place where the most excitement you'd get was a speeding ticket. The move to Kentucky was supposed to bring some adventure, and let me tell you, I got more than I bargained for. When I first got into this line of work, people said it was mainly about finding lost hikers or kids who wandered off the trails. They didn't warn me about the other things in the woods, the things you can't categorize. You see, I wasn't exactly what you'd call an experienced outdoorsman before I took this job. The closest I got to wildlife was grilling burgers in my backyard. But the forest grew on me. It felt like freedom. That was until the day it stopped feeling safe. It was mid-afternoon when the call came in. 2 campers, both young men, had gone missing near Red River Gorge. They had set out the previous morning and hadn't checked back with their friends. That wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. People lose track of time out here all the time. But something about the tone of the call had me on edge. Their friends said they weren't the type to just disappear without a trace. I grabbed my gear and met up with my partner, Carl, an older guy who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. He had that look of someone who'd seen it all, but didn't say much about it. As we drove out to the trailhead, Carl kept tapping the wheel like he had something on his mind. Finally, he said, "You ever hear about that thing up in the gorge?" I glanced at him. "What thing?" He didn't answer right away. "Never mind," he muttered. "Just some stories the locals like to tell to scare tourists." We pulled up to the trailhead where we met the friends of the 2 missing campers. They were all rattled, wide-eyed, and shuffling nervously like something bad had already happened. One of them, a guy with a red bandana wrapped around his head, said they had been hiking together when the 2 missing guys went ahead, wanting to explore a cave they'd found. The rest of the group stayed back, and when their friends didn't return by nightfall, they started worrying. Carl, never one for comforting words, just grunted and motioned for me to follow him. We set out on the trail, winding through dense trees and jagged cliffs. The forest was quiet, too quiet. You start to notice these things when you've been out here long enough. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind and our footsteps crunching on the dirt. Shouldn't there be, some wildlife or something? I asked, trying to break the silence. Carl didn't respond, just picked up the pace, which wasn't exactly reassuring. About an hour in, we found the campsite the missing campers had set up. Tents were there, unzipped, sleeping bags tossed around like they'd left in a hurry. A couple of backpacks were strewn across the ground. What was strange, though, was that there were no signs of a struggle, just an eerie sense of abandonment. I crouched down near one of the backpacks, rifling through it for clues. Inside, I found the usual camping gear, but then I pulled out something odd, a torn piece of fur. It was coarse, thicker than anything I'd seen on a bear or deer. I showed it to Carl, but he just shrugged it off, mumbling something about wild animals. As we moved further into the forest, the trees began to close in around us, their twisted limbs casting distorted shadows on the ground. I felt like we were being watched, like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. Every so often, I'd catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, nothing was there. About half a mile later, we came across something that made my blood run cold. One of the missing campers was slumped against a tree, his body mangled beyond recognition. His torso was torn open, jagged cuts running along his chest and arms, as if something had sliced him up with claws or teeth. There was no blood on the ground, though, which made it even more unsettling. Whatever did this didn't just kill him, it took its time. I staggered back, feeling bile rise in my throat. Carl knelt down to examine the body, his face grim but not surprised. "This isn't normal," he muttered. "No kidding," I whispered. "What could have done this?" Carl stood up slowly, scanning the area. "Not sure, but we need to find the other one." The other one, right. There were 2. I had almost forgotten. My mind was still reeling from the sight in front of me. But we had a job to do. We pressed on, following a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed underbrush. It was getting darker, but we couldn't turn back now. About an hour later, we found the second camper, or at least what was left of him. His body was hanging from a tree, suspended by a mess of vines and branches. It looked like he'd been lifted up and shredded apart, his limbs dangling at odd angles. I could barely breathe at this point. It was like we had stumbled into some twisted hunting ground. "We should call this in," I said, my voice shaking. Carl didn't move. He was staring at something off to the side, just beyond the body. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw it. Movement in the trees. Something was crouching low, its shape barely visible in the shadows. It was huge, larger than anything I'd ever seen before. Its body was covered in matted fur, like that of a wild boar, but its movements were more feline, smooth and predatory. The creature's head was elongated, almost like a wolf's, but it had this strange, twisted quality to it, as if nature had gone wrong somewhere. It stood there for a moment, staring at us, before letting out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in my chest. Carl grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my daze. "Run?" I always figured if anything bad ever happened to me, it would be out on the open road, miles away from anyone who could help. Maybe that's why I started carrying a gun. I never wanted to feel helpless. Not that I've had to use it before, but it's there, tucked under the seat of my rig, just in case. The highway was quieter than usual that night, and I was heading west, cutting through some remote stretch of Wyoming. The air was crisp, a bite of winter hanging on, even though it should have been warmer by now. I had a load of lumber bound for some construction site in Idaho. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mind was on the job. The kind of solitary thinking that comes when you're hours into a long haul. It wasn't until I hit the small, nearly forgotten town of Pine Ridge that things started to feel off. Not that there was much to the place. A single gas station, a diner that looked like it hadn't served a hot meal in years, and a couple of houses with their windows boarded up. I needed to refuel, so I pulled into the gas station, the only sign of life in the whole town. The pump was ancient, the kind where you have to flip the lever to start the gas flowing. As I filled up, I noticed the attendant inside the station, a wiry man with a weathered face. He was watching me, his eyes never leaving me. I gave him a nod, more out of habit than friendliness, but he didn't respond, just kept staring like he was sizing me up. It made my skin crawl, but I chalked it up to small-town suspicion. Strangers don't exactly roll through Pine Ridge every day. I paid for the gas and got back in the truck, eager to put some miles between me and that town. As I pulled out, I noticed an old beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the road. I hadn't seen it when I pulled in, but then again, I wasn't paying much attention. The thing looked like it hadn't run in years, rust eating away at the body and the tires flat against the pavement. An hour later, the road was deserted, just a ribbon of black cutting through the wilderness. That's when I saw the headlights in my mirror. At first, it was just a faint glow, but they got closer. Fast. Too fast. My heart picked up, and I checked my speed. Maybe I was going too slow, but no, I was doing the limit. The lights got brighter, and I could make out the outline of the vehicle behind me. It was that old pickup from Pine Ridge, the same rusted hulk that looked like it shouldn't even be on the road. I kept my eyes on the mirror, expecting the truck to pass me by, but it didn't. Instead, it rode my tail, the headlights nearly blinding me. I tapped the brakes, a warning, but the pickup didn't back off. If anything, it got closer. Something wasn't right. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us, but the pickup matched my speed, staying just a few feet behind me. The road ahead was nothing but darkness, and my mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I reached under the seat, feeling for the cold metal of the gun. My hand gripped the handle, but I didn't pull it out, not yet. There was a turn up ahead, a sharp one. I could lose him there, maybe. I flicked on my blinker, even though there was no one else around to see it, and took the turn hard. For a moment, I thought I'd lost him. The road curved through a dense patch of trees, and I couldn't see the headlights anymore. But then they reappeared, brighter than before, as the pickup tore around the bend, nearly clipping the back of my rig. Panic set in, and I floored it, the engine roaring as I pushed the truck faster than I'd ever dared before. The pickup stayed with me, relentless. I couldn't shake him. And then, like something out of a nightmare, he started ramming me. The first hit jolted me so hard I almost lost control. My trailer fishtailed, the weight of the lumber threatening to tip the whole rig over. I gripped the wheel tighter, fighting to keep us on the road. Another hit, harder this time, and I knew I had to do something, or he'd run me off the road completely. I glanced at the gun still under the seat, but the thought of using it while driving terrified me. Instead, I scanned the road ahead, looking for anything that might help. Up ahead, I saw a narrow dirt road branching off to the right. It wasn't on my map, and I had no idea where it led, but it was my only option. I cut the wheel hard, veering off the main road onto the dirt path. The rig shuddered as the tires hit the rough ground, and I prayed the trailer wouldn't flip. The pickup followed right on my tail, its headlights bouncing in the darkness. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for my truck, and lined with thick trees on either side. I could hear the pickup's engine roaring behind me, getting closer and closer. My mind raced with desperate ideas, none of them good. I could try to lose him in the trees, but one wrong move, and I'd be wrapped around a trunk. And then, out of nowhere, the road ended. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the dirt, and the rig came to a stop just inches from a steep drop-off. The pickup didn't stop. It rammed into the back of my trailer with a sickening crunch, and I heard metal tearing as the trailer swayed dangerously over the edge. The impact threw me forward, and I fought to stay in control. I could feel the weight of the lumber shifting, the whole rig threatening to go over. I had seconds, maybe less. I didn't think. I yanked the gun out from under the seat, kicked open the door, and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the drop-off. The pickup's engine was still running, the headlights casting an eerie glow over the scene. I scrambled to my feet, the gun in my hand, and turned to face the pickup. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in grease and grime, his clothes tattered, hanging off him like they'd been through hell. He didn't say a word, just started walking toward me, his steps slow and deliberate. I leveled the gun at him, my hands shaking. "Stay back!" I shouted, but he kept coming. Closer now, I could see his face. It was twisted, scarred, like he'd been in 100 fights and lost every one of them. His eyes were cold, empty, like there was nothing human left inside him. He didn't stop. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and the man staggered but didn't go down. He looked at me, more surprised than hurt, and then kept coming. I fired again, and this time he dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt. But he wasn't dead. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a knife, and lunged at me. I fired a third time, hitting him square in the chest. He crumpled to the ground, finally still. I stood there, gasping for breath, the gun still in my hand. The night was silent now, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I walked over to the pickup, looking for any sign of why he'd chased me, but there was nothing. The cab was empty, no ID, no belongings, just a truck that shouldn't have been running. I looked back at the man, his body lying lifeless on the ground. There was no question he was dead. I had the gun, the spent shells, and his blood on my hands. This wasn't something I could just drive away from. But as I stood there, I realized something else. The rig was teetering on the edge, the weight of the lumber pulling it closer to the drop-off. I ran back to it, climbed inside, and slowly, carefully backed it away from the edge. Once I was clear, I drove back to the main road, my heart still pounding. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I found a diner that was still open. I sat in a booth, the gun hidden in my jacket, and ordered a coffee. The waitress gave me a strange look, but didn't say anything. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not even the cops. When they eventually found the man's body a few days later, the newspapers called it a tragic accident. An unidentified man found dead in the woods. They never connected it to me, and I never offered up any information. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and got back on the road. The sun was starting to rise, and I had miles to go before my next stop. As I drove, I tried not to think about the man or why he'd come after me. It didn't matter now. He was dead, and I was still alive. That was enough. I thought this trip would fix everything. I thought that a week out in the woods, just me and Tyler, would somehow repair the damage from the past year. The divorce hit him harder than it hit me, and that's saying something. I thought maybe, out here in the quiet, away from the distractions of phones and the city, we could connect again. You know, like fathers and sons are supposed to. But from the moment we hit the road, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Tyler barely looked up from his phone the entire drive, earbuds in, scrolling mindlessly. He didn't care about the scenery, didn't care that we were headed to Deadwood Creek, a place I used to go with my own dad when I was his age. It's funny how history repeats itself. My father and I never really saw eye to eye either. He'd brought me out here, hoping to teach me how to be a man, how to survive in the wilderness, and now here I was, doing the same with Tyler, hoping the Black Hills would heal something in both of us. I glanced at him as we pulled into the campground. He didn't even notice the tall, dark pines surrounding us, swaying lightly in the wind. A dense fog had settled over the creek, and the sound of water trickling nearby was the only noise besides the RV's engine. It felt different than I remembered, more isolated, lonelier. "This is it," I said, more to myself than to Tyler. "Cool," he mumbled, still scrolling, not even looking up. I sighed, cutting the engine. After we set up camp, I suggested a short hike to check out the creek. Tyler grumbled but followed me. The trail was just as I remembered, narrow, winding through the trees, with the creek gurgling beside us. There was something peaceful about it, but also something off. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching us. We reached the creek's edge, where the water ran fast over the rocks. I crouched down, letting the cool water run over my hand. "This place used to be full of miners back in the gold rush days," I said, trying to make conversation. "A lot of people came out here looking to strike it rich. Some of them didn't make it out." Tyler shrugged. "I guess," he said. I stood up and brushed off my hands. Frustrated. "You know, you could try enjoying this." He looked up from his phone for the first time and scowled. "I didn't ask to come here." I bit my tongue, holding back the argument that wanted to burst out. "Let's head back to camp." As we turned to leave, something flickered in my peripheral vision. I stopped, squinting through the trees. There, just at the edge of the clearing, a dim light floated in the distance. It flickered like a lantern, swaying in the wind. "Did you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the trees. Tyler glanced up, following my gaze. "What? That light?" It was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I'd imagined it. The fog had thickened while we were by the creek, and the woods were growing darker. Never mind, let's go. The first night was when things started getting weird. Tyler and I had retreated to the RV after dinner. He was predictably glued to his phone while I tried to read a book, but the quiet gnawed at me. The stillness outside felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The wind had picked up, and the pines swayed ominously against the backdrop of the night. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, barely there sound like whispers carried on the breeze. But as I listened, it grew more distinct. Not the wind, voices, faint, disembodied voices murmuring just outside the RV. "Did you hear that?" I asked, sitting up straighter. "What?" Tyler didn't even look up. "The voices outside." Tyler pulled out one of his earbuds, frowning. "What are you talking about?" I stood up and went to the window, peering out into the darkness. Nothing but fog and trees. But I could still hear the whispers just at the edge of hearing, like they were coming from the creek. I shook my head. Probably just the wind. Tyler rolled his eyes and went back to his phone, but something about those whispers unsettled me. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, the air felt even heavier. Tyler was still distant, sulking around camp, so I suggested another hike, hoping it would clear the tension between us. He reluctantly agreed, and we set off down the trail again, heading back toward the creek. But this time, The unease I'd felt the day before was stronger. Every rustle in the trees, every crack of a branch set me on edge. As we walked, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was constant now, like eyes were following us from the shadows. Then I saw it again. The light. This time it was brighter, flickering between the trees ahead of us, moving slowly, like a lantern being carried by an unseen hand. "There it is," I whispered, grabbing Tyler's arm. "Do you see it?" He stopped, frowning. "What? What are you talking about?" The light flickered in and out, growing dimmer before vanishing completely. I took a step forward, but Tyler grabbed my arm. "Dad, let's just go back." I wanted to argue, but the look on his face, the fear in his eyes, stopped me. Truth be told, I was scared too. "Yeah, let's go." That night, the footsteps started. It was late, maybe past midnight, and I just managed to drift off when I heard them. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel outside the RV. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, but the steps were too heavy, too purposeful. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as the footsteps circled the RV. They stopped by the window, then moved to the door. Tyler stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. I slipped out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the window, slowly pulling back the curtain. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and there, just at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was tall, dressed in ragged, old-fashioned clothes, like something out of the Gold Rush era. A wide-brimmed hat covered most of its face, but I could see the gleam of a lantern hanging from its hand. The figure stood perfectly still, just watching the RV. I stumbled back, heart racing. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the fog, the light of its lantern disappearing with it. The next day, Tyler was pale and jittery, his usual teenage indifference replaced with genuine fear. He hadn't seen the figure, but he'd heard the footsteps, and the look in his eyes told me he knew something was wrong. "We need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," I replied. "I'll start the RV. We'll head out." But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine sputtered, then went silent. I tried again and again, but the RV wouldn't start. "We're stuck here," I muttered, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more insistent. The figure was back, pacing around the RV, dragging something behind it. I could hear the heavy scrape of metal on gravel, like chains being dragged along the ground. "Dad, what is that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale with fear. I didn't have an answer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the door. "Stay inside," I told him. "No, don't go out there," he begged, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't just sit there, listening to the thing outside. I had to confront it. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The figure was there, standing by the creek, its lantern casting an eerie glow over the water. It didn't move as I approached, just watched me with shadowed eyes. "What do you want?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. "What are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly lifted its arm, pointing to the ground near the water's edge. There, half buried in the mud, was an old rusted gold pan. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me, the legend, the miner's ghost protecting his lost fortune. I knelt down, my hands trembling, and lifted the pan from the mud. As soon as I touched it, the figure vanished. The footsteps stopped. The whispers and the wind fell silent. The air was lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I stood there for a long time, holding the gold pan, my mind racing. Then, without looking back, I turned and went back to the RV. The next morning, the RV started without a hitch. We left Deadwood Creek behind, and neither of us spoke about what happened. But as we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure watching us from the trees. I didn't, but I knew, deep down, that something had happened out there. Something I couldn't explain, something I would never forget. And maybe, just maybe, Tyler and I would be okay. I didn't believe in ghosts. UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even, but as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. Focus, I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were, three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black, the screen dead. What the hell? I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me. And I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference, some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold. So cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees heaters? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large. I watched, heart pounding, as they bobbed and weaved. Their glow cast long shadows on the ground. I pulled out my phone to take a video. The screen flashed, then went black. It wouldn't turn on. Frustration boiled over. I slammed the phone down on the camping table. It bounced. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to keep my cool. This was why people got sucked into believing nonsense, because technology failed at the worst possible moment. The lights weren't supernatural. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the cold was messing with the equipment, or some kind of atmospheric distortion. But then I saw the handprints. Small, faint handprints etched in frost on the RV window. They hadn't been there before. I knew that. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest, close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes. Faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same. The same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light. Quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead. A welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints. Dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal, and the frost melted away. But I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew deep down that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more, something ancient, something dangerous, something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. I was halfway up Blackwater Ridge when Glenn warned me about the lights. His bait shop was the last stop before the mountain trail turned into pure wilderness, and I dropped in for some extra firewood. He was standing behind the counter, leaning on his elbows, watching me load up my supplies. His words hung in the air long after they left his mouth. "People get lost up there," he said, his voice low and cautious. "You hear the stories?" I zipped up my jacket and shook my head. What stories? About the lights. They show up when the sun goes down, start flickering in the trees like they're leading you somewhere. But you follow them. You don't come back. I should have known better than to brush him off. I should have asked more questions. But the truth was, I didn't care. I wasn't here for ghost stories or local superstitions. I was here to clear my head after everything that had happened with Ryan, the breakup, the endless nights of replaying every argument in my head. I needed this time away from the world. Just me and my RV parked in the middle of nowhere. Blackwater Ridge had seemed perfect, a remote place where no one could find me, and more importantly, where I wouldn't be tempted to find anyone. "I'll be fine," I told Glenn, trying to smile, but his eyes were serious, unblinking. "Just watch yourself," he said, handing me a small pouch as I paid for the wood. "Keep this with you. Some folks say it helps." "What is it?" "Just something my family's passed down," he said, avoiding my gaze. "Might keep the lights away." I didn't believe in that kind of thing, but I pocketed the pouch anyway, more out of politeness than anything else. Then I left the shop, got into my RV, and made my way up the winding mountain road toward Blackwater Ridge. The campsite was exactly what I'd hoped for. Deserted, overgrown, and tucked away in a grove of tall pines. The air smelled crisp and clean, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The old campground looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There were a few rusted RVs half hidden in the foliage, relics of past campers who had either left them behind or forgotten about them altogether. I parked my RV at the far edge of the grove, close enough to the trees to feel enclosed, but far enough from the abandoned vehicles to avoid any weird vibes. It was perfect, a place to disconnect and forget. That first day was peaceful. I went for a hike, snapped a few photos, and by the time the sun was setting, I was sitting outside by the fire pit, listening to the crackling flames and sipping from a thermos of tea. The sky was clear, and the stars began to poke through the darkness, dotting the sky like tiny pinpricks of light. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A small flickering light deep in the woods just past the tree line. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but it was too big. It moved slowly, gliding through the trees like it was looking for something, or someone. I sat up, narrowing my eyes to focus. The light was faint but unmistakable. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat, its glow barely reaching me through the dense pines. Then another light appeared beside it. Then another. 3 faint orbs flickering in unison, moving deeper into the forest. Glenn's warning about the lights echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. They were probably just campers in the distance, or maybe a reflection from a house far off the ridge. I wasn't about to let some old superstition spook me on my first night. I sat back, trying to relax, but the lights wouldn't leave me alone. They moved again, gliding slowly through the trees as if they were beckoning me to follow. I could almost hear a whisper in the air, like soft voices drifting on the wind. "Come closer." I stood abruptly, shaking my head. "No," I muttered to myself. "You're not doing this. You came here to get away, not chase after stupid lights in the woods." But the longer I stood there, the harder it was to ignore them. They were so gentle, so inviting. It felt like they were calling me, pulling at some part of me that I couldn't explain. My feet shifted forward, inching toward the forest edge. "Come." I blinked, snapping out of it. What was I doing? I wasn't about to follow some strange lights into the woods. Glenn had warned me, hadn't he? I couldn't let myself get sucked into this nonsense. I backed away from the trees, heart pounding, and went back into my RV, slamming the door behind me. The lights flickered one last time outside the window before they disappeared, swallowed by the darkness. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the morning hiking, trying to focus on anything but what had happened the night before. But the woods felt different now, quieter. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves had faded, replaced by a stillness that pressed in on me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees or the faintest flicker of light just out of sight. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting Glenn's warning get under my skin. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. By the time evening came, the anxiety had settled into my bones. I lit another fire and sat outside, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the lights came back. This time, they were closer. I watched, frozen, as they flickered between the trees, more of them now. 5, maybe 6, all moving in the same slow, rhythmic pattern. They circled the edge of the campground, their glow soft but persistent. I felt that same pull again, stronger this time, like invisible hands reaching out to me. Come. The whispers were clearer now, louder. They filled my ears, my mind, drowning out everything else. It sounded like his voice, Ryan. His soft, pleading tone asking me to come closer, to follow. I stood, my body moving of its own accord. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was need. I needed to know what these lights were, where they were leading me. Maybe it was Ryan. Maybe he'd followed me, wanted to make things right. The thought was irrational, but in that moment, it made perfect sense. I took a step toward the forest, then another. My heart raced as I approached the tree line, the lights growing brighter, more vivid. But as I crossed into the shadows, something shifted in the air. The forest felt wrong, twisted, like the trees were closing in around me. The lights flickered erratically, their gentle glow turning sharp, jagged. I froze. The whispers turned darker, harsher. Come now. No, this wasn't right. This wasn't Ryan. This was something else, something wrong. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The lights surged forward, surrounding me, blinding me. In desperation, I grabbed the pouch Glenn had given me, clutching it tightly. The lights flickered wildly, then dimmed. I backed away as the whispers receded, and the lights finally disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark woods, shaking. I always hated feeling tethered to anything, so when the relationship ended, I knew I had to get away. No more distractions, no more emotional baggage. I just needed a break. Crater Lake seemed perfect, beautiful, isolated, and most importantly, quiet. I packed my old RV, grabbed some hiking gear, and headed out for a long weekend of camping. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning to set behind the towering cliffs surrounding the lake. Crater Lake was as stunning as I'd imagined. Deep blue waters, so clear they reflected the sky, encircled by jagged cliffs that loomed like ancient sentinels. The park was busy enough near the main viewpoints, but I was smart. I'd found a campsite far from the crowds, tucked away near the southeastern shore where the trees were thick and the lake was quieter, almost unnervingly so. It was just what I wanted, solitude. But as I parked my RV and set up camp, a strange feeling settled over me. The wind was too still, and even though the lake was calm, there was a low hum in the air, like the whisper of something just out of earshot. I shook it off. Just nerves, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. After all, I hadn't done a solo trip like this since before I met Sarah. The memories tugged at me, but I pushed them away. I spent the first evening by the fire, watching the stars come out as the lake turned to ink. Crater Lake was famous for its clarity, its mirror-like surface reflecting everything above it perfectly. But tonight, the water looked different, darker, maybe even opaque. I stared out across the lake, trying to ignore the strange tightness in my chest when I heard it. A faint sound carried on the wind, laughter, childlike, distant, but unmistakable. I sat up, listening harder. The night was still, but there it was again, faint but clear. I scanned the shoreline, looking for anyone else camping nearby. Nothing but fog creeping over the water and the flickering shadows of my fire. Probably kids playing somewhere across the lake, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. I was too far out. The ranger had said as much when I checked in. This spot was about as secluded as you could get. Besides, the laughter didn't sound right. It was high-pitched, but it echoed strangely, like it was bouncing off the cliffs and the water at the same time. Shaking my head, I stood and stoked the fire, trying to lose myself in the warmth. The sound died away after a few minutes, and eventually I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the wind, or maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive, after all. I crawled into the RV that night, settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful sleep, but the unease stayed with me. clinging to my mind like the fog that now blanketed the campsite. I dreamt of the lake, shapes moving beneath the surface, dark and indistinct, like hands reaching up from the depths. The next day was better. I hiked along the rim of the lake, took in the views, and even managed to shake off some of the weird vibes from the night before. The sunlight was bright and reassuring, cutting through the mist, and the water looked clearer now, less murky. I convinced myself I'd just been tired. That's all it had been. By afternoon, I decided to take the kayak out. The water was calm, almost unnaturally so. The kayak sliced through the surface effortlessly, and for a while, I let myself enjoy it. The silence of the lake was peaceful, broken only by the soft splash of my paddle. Then the ripples started. At first, they were small, nothing more than the gentle rocking of water disturbed by a fish, maybe. But as I moved farther out, the ripples became more pronounced. They seemed to come from nowhere, disturbing the otherwise glassy surface of the lake. I stopped paddling, staring at the water, trying to figure out where they were coming from. There was nothing. No fish, no breeze, no sign of anything that could cause the water to move like that. But the ripples were there, spreading out from somewhere beneath the kayak. That's when I saw it, a dark shape, maybe 15 feet below, moving slowly. It was too large to be a fish and too humanoid to be anything I could easily explain. It floated there for a moment before drifting deeper, vanishing into the darkness. I blinked, gripping my paddle tighter. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it was a log, I reasoned, or some weird optical illusion. I was looking through layers of water, after all, and who knew how light refracted down there? But deep down, I didn't believe it. I paddled back to shore faster than I cared to admit, my eyes glued to the water the whole time, watching for any more signs of movement. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was starting to dip, and the fog was rolling in again, thicker this time. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the trees, and with it came that faint sound again. Laughter. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I stood at the edge of the lake, staring out into the mist, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It was definitely children's voices now, several of them, giggling and splashing. But as I scanned the shoreline, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was no one there. No boats, no campers. Just the fog hanging low over the water like a shroud. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I should have packed up right then, driven away, and never looked back. But I stayed. Stupid, I know. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Crater Lake had its fair share of myths and legends, but I didn't believe in that stuff. I'd never been the superstitious type. Then I saw them, just shadows at first. Small figures standing at the water's edge, half obscured by the fog. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. They were small, like children, but their outlines were blurred, indistinct. I blinked, trying to focus, and in that split second, they were gone. I stepped back from the shore, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't seeing things. They were there. I'd seen them. A cold chill washed over me as the wind died, leaving the air deathly still. The whispers started again, faint and melodic, drifting across the water. But this time, they were louder, closer. I backed toward the RV, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing behind me. Nothing. I fumbled with the RV door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. I sat there in the dim light, listening. The whispers grew louder, like they were pressing in on me from all sides. It was as if the voices were coming from the lake itself, echoing relentlessly. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but it didn't stop. The sound seeped into my mind, becoming clearer, more distinct. I could hear the splashing of water and the soft giggles turning into cries. It was children drowning, calling for help. I could hear their little hands slapping against the surface of the water, their desperate gasps for air. My breath hitched, panic rising in my chest. I had to get out of here. I threw my gear into the RV, not caring about the mess, as I reached for the ignition. The RV's lights flickered and died. The engine wouldn't turn over. I cursed under my breath, frantically trying the key again and again. Nothing. Outside, the whispers grew louder. I could hear the faint tapping now, soft knocks against the RV windows. My blood ran cold as I turned. Handprints, small, wet handprints, appeared on the windows, slowly sliding down the glass. The whispers turned into cries. The tapping grew more frantic, louder, as if they were trying to get in, trying to pull me out to the water. I backed away, my mind spinning, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. The air inside the RV felt suffocating, thick with dread. Then I heard it, splashing, close, right outside, like something was struggling in the water. Without thinking, I rushed to the door, flinging it open. The fog was so thick now I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I could hear the cries for help, the child's voice desperate, calling for me. Help me. Please. My legs carried me toward the lake before my brain could catch up. The water lapped softly at the shore. The cries were louder, more desperate. I could see something out there, flailing in the shallows, a small figure, arms reaching up, struggling against the current. I was almost at the water's edge when the fog shifted just enough for me to see it clearly. The child was translucent, its skin pale and waterlogged. Its eyes were wide, empty sockets. Its mouth was open in a silent scream as it reached for me. Wet, skeletal hands clawed at the water, pulling it closer to me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The figure stopped struggling, its head tilting to one side as if studying me. Then it smiled, a cold, unnatural smile that chilled me to my core. I ran, my feet pounding the earth as I raced back to the RV. The laughter faded into the distance, echoing through the fog. I slammed the door behind me, locking it again, collapsing to the floor, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers, the laughter, the tapping on the windows, they didn't stop until dawn. When the sun finally broke through the fog, I packed up and drove away without looking back. I didn't care that the RV was barely running or that I left half my gear behind. I just needed to get away from that lake. But even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I can still hear them sometimes. The faint whispers, the splashing of water, the laughter. Crater Lake isn't as quiet as it seems, and I know they're still there, waiting. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, their pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey, Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know. They feel weird. Not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place? Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. Sounds like folklore to me. Maybe, Ethan said, his tone serious now. But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you. And the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings. I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. Thanks for the heads up, I said, trying to keep my voice light. But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts. Ethan sighed. Just don't go too deep, okay? Call if you need anything. I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone, as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise, a low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. The sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach knotting with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it, vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern, a rhythmic pulse like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me. Something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it, but the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried, something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth. And I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't be going back. I hadn't planned on staying at Stillwater Grove. The campground wasn't even marked on my map, just a small patch of green near the edge of Shawnee National Forest. But as I drove down the empty forest road, I saw the sign, old, weathered wood with the words Stillwater Grove Campground carved into it. It felt like an invitation, one I couldn't resist. I'd been on the road for weeks, photographing wildlife for a personal project I'd picked up after quitting my job. The last few months had been a blur of long drives, lonely campsites, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere but back in the city. I didn't miss my corporate job or my ex. What I did miss was the feeling that I knew what the hell I was doing with my life. Stillwater Grove seemed perfect, quiet, isolated, and right by the lake. It would give me the break I needed, some peace before heading back into the real world. When I pulled into the campsite, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grove. The air was still, the only sound being the gentle lapping of water against the shore. A single RV sat on the far side of the campground, a distant figure moving near it. Otherwise, it was just me. I parked my RV near the edge of the lake, the water glistening under the fading light. After setting up camp, I grabbed my camera and headed toward the shore, hoping to catch the sunset. As I stood there, framing the perfect shot, a voice startled me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her face half in shadow. She had an otherworldly kind of beauty, pale skin, long dark hair, and eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Yeah," I replied, lowering my camera. "It's peaceful." She smiled. "It always is here." "I'm Ellie, by the way." "Nick," I said, shaking her outstretched hand. Her skin was cold, like she'd been standing in the shade for too long. "You camping here too?" "For a little while," she said, her voice soft. "I come here every now and then. Can't stay away." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I wasn't used to talking to people much anymore. The solitude had become my comfort zone, and something about Ellie felt out of place. "You here for the fishing?" I asked, trying to make small talk. She shook her head. "No, just the lake, the quiet." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, the water reflecting the colors like a mirror. I raised my camera, snapping a few shots, and when I looked back, Ellie was gone, just like that. I glanced around, but there was no sign of her. The other RV was still parked at the far end of the grove, but there was no movement. I chalked it up to her being quick on her feet, though it left me feeling oddly unsettled. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside rustle against each other like whispered secrets. I rolled over in bed, trying to find a comfortable position, but something felt off. The RV was too cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the thermostat, but everything seemed normal. Still, the chill lingered. I grabbed a blanket and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a woman's voice carried on the wind. I sat up, listening, but it was gone. Just my imagination, I thought. Long days alone in the woods will do that to you. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a soft melodic humming coming from outside. I climbed out of bed, grabbing my flashlight. My breath fogged up in the cold air as I stepped outside the RV, scanning the campsite. Nothing. Just the stillness of the lake and the trees swaying gently in the wind. But the humming persisted, coming from near the water's edge. I walked toward the shore, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the ground. And that's when I saw her. A woman in white, standing at the edge of the lake, her back to me. Her long, dark hair hung loose down her back, swaying slightly as she hummed that haunting tune. "Ellie?" I called out, my voice shaking. She didn't turn. She just stood there, motionless, her gaze fixed on the water. Something about the way she stood, so still, so rigid, set my nerves on edge. I took a step closer, the flashlight illuminating her pale figure. But as soon as the light touched her, she vanished. I blinked, stunned. 1 second, she'd been there, and the next, she was gone. The water rippled where she had been standing, but otherwise, the lake was empty. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was that? I hurried back to the RV, locking the door behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. My hands were shaking. I didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense, but what I'd seen, it wasn't right. I had seen her. I knew I had. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to rationalize what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image of that woman standing by the lake. The next morning, I found Ellie near the grove, sitting by a small campfire. She smiled when she saw me, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Rough night?" she asked, as if she already knew. "Yeah," I said, sitting down across from her. "I saw something last night, a woman by the lake. I thought it was you, but she wasn't there when you got close." Ellie finished, her voice calm, too calm. "The Lady of Stillwater." "The what?" I asked, feeling a chill run through me. Ellie looked at me, her eyes dark and hollow. "She's been here for a long time, longer than the campground, longer than the trees. She drowned in the lake, or so the story goes. Some say she was waiting for someone. Her lover, I think, but he never showed." I stared at her, my stomach twisting. "You're telling me she's a ghost?" Ellie shrugged. "Call it what you want, but she's real. And now that you've seen her, she won't let you go." I laughed, though it came out shaky. "That's insane." "Is it?" Ellie asked, her gaze locking onto mine. "You saw her. You know she's real." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat. I had seen her, and it hadn't been a trick of the light or my imagination. Something had been there, something that shouldn't have been. "What does she want?" I asked quietly. Ellie's eyes flicked toward the lake. "She wants what she's always wanted, to take someone with her into the water." That night, the sound started again. At first, it was the soft humming drifting through the night air, then the splashing, gentle, rhythmic, like someone wading through the water. I lay in bed, my heart racing, my body tense. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to see her again. But the pull was stronger this time. A strange compulsion tugged at me, drawing me toward the lake. I tried to fight it, to stay in the RV, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me outside into the cold night air. The lake was calm, reflecting the pale moonlight. And there she was, standing in the water, her white dress billowing around her as if moved by an unseen current. "Come to me," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. "Please, come." I took a step forward, my body moving against my will. The water lapped at my shoes, and I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. "Come with me," she said again, her voice almost pleading now. I've waited so long. I fought to resist, to break free from whatever force was drawing me in. But my feet kept moving, the water now up to my knees, freezing cold. I could feel the pull of the lake, the weight of the water dragging me down. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm, yanking me back with such force that I stumbled onto the shore. Ellie stood beside me, her face pale, her grip strong. "You have to leave," she said, her voice urgent now. "Before it's too late." I looked back at the lake, but the woman was gone. The water was still, as if nothing had happened. "What the hell is happening?" I gasped, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Ellie's expression was grim. "She's marked you now. If you stay, she'll take you. You have to go." I didn't argue. I packed up my things, my hands shaking, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Within minutes, I was back in the RV, starting the engine and pulling out of the campsite as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Ellie stood at the edge of the grove, watching me go, her face unreadable, and behind her, just barely visible in the mist, was the Lady of Stillwater, her pale eyes following me, waiting for me to return. I didn't look back again. The Great Smoky Mountains had always been a dream destination, a place of beauty, solitude, and isolation where I could lose myself in the woods and maybe find myself again. After the breakup with Eric, I needed an escape, something to remind me that I was capable, that I could handle life on my own. Mark, of course, wouldn't let me do it alone. My brother insisted on coming along, and with him came Na, his bubbly girlfriend, and Lucas, a friend of his who seemed more interested in me than the mountains. The whole trip was supposed to be a solo adventure, but I caved. I figured I could handle them for a weekend. We set out early on Friday, and the trailhead was already buzzing with tourists, their laughter filling the crisp morning air. Mark led the way, checking his map obsessively while lugging around half a camping store's worth of gear. He liked to over-prepare for everything. Na, naturally cheerful, hummed some pop song as she skipped along behind him. Lucas stuck close to me, his jokes falling flat and his flirtations rolling off me like water on rock. I was there for the hike. The Smokies were breathtaking. The way the mist clung to the rolling hills, the distant sound of water rushing through the trees, the deep green of the pines and ferns that hugged the path. If I could just let myself melt into that wilderness, I thought, I might forget the reason I came here in the first place. But that sense of peace didn't last long. By the time we reached the more remote trail where we planned to camp, the crowds had thinned out. It was just us, and I was grateful for the quiet, at least at first. But as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, a strange heaviness settled over the forest. The cheerful calls of birds disappeared, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Something feels off," I said, mostly to myself. "You're just not used to the quiet," Lucas replied, a grin plastered on his face. "This is the best part. Just us and the wild." I nodded, but couldn't shake the sensation. As we set up camp, Mark was his usual methodical self, making sure the tents were positioned perfectly and ensuring the fire pit was well constructed. Meanwhile, Lucas's tent wouldn't stay upright. The poles sagged despite his best efforts. Na laughed at his struggle, but I could sense the rising frustration. "You didn't exactly bring a 5-star hotel, huh?" she teased. I didn't blame her for laughing. Lucas's tent was a joke, but when the wind picked up later that night, it was less funny. The flimsy thing shook and collapsed in on him. Halfway through dinner, Mark offered to help him fix it, but Lucas waved him off. "I'll manage," he muttered, clearly embarrassed. I felt a twinge of guilt, but the night was closing in fast, and we all needed rest. We sat around the fire, the woods around us thick with shadows. The Smokies, which had seemed so beautiful just hours earlier, now felt ominous. We were miles from the nearest ranger station, out of cell service, with nothing but trees and mountains for company. And then, just as we were beginning to relax, we heard it, a distant scream. It was high-pitched, echoing through the valley. It wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. The sound made my skin crawl. "Cougar," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Yeah, right," Lucas scoffed, throwing another log on the fire. That's the Wampus cat. He grinned, as if he'd just cracked some hilarious joke, but no one laughed. I hadn't grown up around here, but I knew enough about Appalachian folklore to recognize the name. The Wampus cat was the stuff of campfire stories. Half woman, half beast, cursed to stalk the woods and hunt down anyone who ventured too far from civilization. Don't joke about that, Na said, her voice wavering. People say they've seen it. Mark, ever the pragmatist, rolled his eyes. It's just a legend. Probably an owl or something. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fire cast long shadows, and every crack of a twig in the distance made my heart skip. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire and Na's cheerful chatter, but the unease settled deep into my bones. When I went to bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of leaves outside my tent sounded too close. I kept thinking about that scream and the way it had seemed to echo from all directions. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next day, the tension between us started to show. Mark was irritable, frustrated that we weren't sticking to his planned itinerary. Na tried to keep the mood light, but her jokes felt forced. Lucas was quieter than usual, as though the previous night's collapse of his tent had deflated his bravado. It didn't help that the wildlife we encountered seemed wrong. Deer stood unnaturally still, watching us with glassy eyes. We came across a black bear in the distance, and instead of lumbering away as they usually do, it stood on its hind legs, staring at us for far too long. I didn't mention it to the others, but I noticed that every time we passed an animal, it was facing us, not the other way around. "They're just curious," Mark said when I finally pointed it out, but I wasn't so sure. By the time we made it back to camp that evening, a low fog had settled in around the trees, shrouding everything in a thick, wet blanket. My unease from the night before returned, stronger than ever. I set my gear down near the fire pit and wandered toward the edge of camp, drawn to the stillness that felt too unnatural. As I stood there scanning the woods, something moved in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow, a blur of movement between the trees. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. Something humanoid, but not quite. It was tall, hunched, and moved with a feline grace. For a split second, I swore I saw glowing yellow eyes staring back at me from the shadows. "Hannah?" I jumped, startled by Mark's voice. "Yeah," I lied, turning back to the fire, but I kept looking over my shoulder, searching the tree line for any sign of the creature. Nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. That night, the woods came alive with sound. The same scream echoed through the trees, but this time it was closer, louder. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, something big moving through the underbrush. Na woke with a start, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Something's out there." Lucas sat up too, his face pale in the firelight. "It's the Wampus cat," he said. But this time there was no humor in his voice. I glanced at Mark, hoping for some reassurance, but even he looked rattled. "We need to stay together," Mark said, his voice low and steady. "Whatever it is, it's probably just curious. Let's not provoke it." But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer, branches breaking, heavy footsteps circling our camp. I gripped the camping knife I kept in my pack, my hands slick with sweat. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely piercing the thick fog that had rolled in again, and then it attacked. It happened so fast. 1 minute, we were huddled around the fire, and the next, something lunged from the shadows, knocking Lucas off his feet. He screamed, scrambling to get away, but the creature, whatever it was, slashed at him with claws I could barely see. Blood sprayed across the campsite, dark and viscous in the firelight. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Na and pulling her toward the trail, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the thing that had attacked Lucas. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, half human, half mountain lion, its eyes glowing yellow as it crouched over him, growling low in its throat. "Hannah!" Mark yelled again, and that snapped me out of it. I ran. The four of us tore through the woods, barely able to see the trail in the thick fog. I could hear Lucas behind us, his footsteps growing fainter, his breath ragged. The Wampus cat was toying with us, letting us run, letting us think we had a chance. It let out another ear-piercing scream, and I knew it was coming for us. "We need to stop it!" I gasped, my lungs burning as I struggled to keep up with Mark and Na. "Fire!" Mark glanced back at me, his face pale with fear. "It's scared of fire." "We can't stop now," I said, but we didn't have a choice. The Wampus cat was right behind us, its footsteps growing louder, closer. I could see the glow of its eyes through the trees, the way it moved, darting between the shadows. We reached the edge of a clearing, and Mark stopped dead in his tracks. "Hannah, light it! Light everything!" I fumbled with the matches in my pack, my hands shaking. We piled everything we had, gear, clothes, food, into a makeshift bonfire and lit it. The flames roared to life, casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, the Wampus cat hesitated, its eyes reflecting the firelight. It circled the edge of the clearing, growling low in its throat, but it didn't come closer. We stood there, panting, watching as the creature melted back into the shadows, its eyes the last thing to disappear. We stayed there until dawn, huddled around the fire, too scared to move. Lucas never caught up. By morning, we were exhausted, bloodied, and broken, but we were alive. We never found Lucas's body. Mark didn't talk about what happened, and Na didn't speak much either. We made it back to the ranger station, where they told us we'd probably been attacked by a bear, but I knew better. The Wampus cat was real, and it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of the low national forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape. A test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this. At least, that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small, trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away, nestled under the towering pines. It was empty. No sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. A perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off, too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death. Mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. "Get it together, Hannah," I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him, a man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly, and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. "Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season." "I wasn't expecting anyone either," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some time alone, you know?" "Yeah, I get that," he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years." I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, who knew the woods like the back of his hand. I didn't. "Be careful out here," Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. "Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down." My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. "Let me guess. Ghost stories? Miners and all that?" Rick's expression didn't change. "Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp." He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was quiet, the temperature inside dropping faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was more than that. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools, mining tools, pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I was just imagining it. This was what I came here for, solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was getting louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The sound of the creek was louder now, rushing over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. But then I saw them. Figures, shadowy, half-formed shapes moving by the creek. Their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They moved like they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing, but as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. "Easy," he said, raising his hands. "I saw your light, thought I'd come check on you." I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen. But Rick didn't need me to. He just looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. "They come out at night, the miners. Been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell." I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. "You mean you know about this? What is this place?" Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. "Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights, they're just echoes. Other nights..." He trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. You get used to the rhythm of the road after a while. The hum of the engine beneath you, the steady pull of the truck, the highway stretching out like a never-ending ribbon. It's a kind of solitude I've come to appreciate over the years. I'm Ben Grady, though most folks call me Bear on account of my size, and I've been behind the wheel for a long time. Trucking's simple. You pick up a load, drop it off, and keep moving. That's what I liked about it. But this job was different from the start. I'd picked up the trailer in Chicago. The client was a slick, suited guy, one of those corporate types. Barely even looked at me as he handed over the papers. "Keep the trailer locked," he said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. No stops, no questions. I should have known something was off. The pay was double the usual rate, too good for a straightforward haul across I-80 to Salt Lake City. But I was behind on bills, and after the divorce. Well, you don't say no to easy money. Now, somewhere between Kearney and North Platte, Nebraska, in the dead of night, that easy money was starting to feel like blood money. The road was empty, save for the occasional distant glow of farmhouses, but otherwise, it was just me, my rig, and miles of flat highway. Nothing but darkness ahead and behind. My truck's headlights cut through the night, illuminating the white lines on the road, but something about the blackness beyond felt heavier than usual, like it was waiting. I tried not to think too hard about it. Just keep driving, get to Salt Lake, drop the load, and forget about it. Simple. But then the first strange thing happened. The truck's temperature gauge started going haywire, flipping between cold and hot so fast I thought it was broken. First, the cab was freezing. Then it was sweltering, all within minutes. I pulled over onto the shoulder, popped the hood, and checked the engine. Everything looked fine. I chalked it up to a glitch in the electronics. These rigs are built to last, but every now and then something acts up. Satisfied I wasn't about to fry the engine, I climbed back in. But as I settled into the driver's seat, I heard it, a soft thump from the trailer. I froze, my hand halfway to the ignition. It was faint, but there was no mistaking it. Something had moved in the back. I forced myself to breathe slowly. It's nothing, probably just the cargo shifting. Hell, I didn't even know what was in there. But heavy loads can settle like that. Still, a knot twisted in my gut. It was too quiet, too deliberate. For a second, I thought about checking the trailer, but the client's voice echoed in my mind. Keep it locked. No stops, no questions. Fine. I wasn't going to ask any questions, and I sure as hell wasn't going to break the lock. I fired up the engine and got back on the road, but the tension lingered. The temperature gauge flickered again. I adjusted the air vents, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. A few miles down the highway, the radio crackled to life. I nearly jumped out of my seat. "Ben," a voice whispered through the static. I stared at the CB, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't heard another trucker's voice all night. The road was dead empty. The voice on the radio, though, it wasn't a trucker. It was my voice. I grabbed the mic, my knuckles white around it. Who the hell is this? The static fizzled, then came back stronger, hissing and popping in my ears. "Ben, you need to stop." I dropped the mic like it was burning my hand, cursing under my breath. It had to be a prank, someone screwing around on the frequency, maybe picking up my name from a previous broadcast. But that didn't make sense. The only chatter I'd had was hours ago, and I hadn't said much more than where I was heading. As I stared at the radio, a chill crawled over me. Then the trailer thumped again, louder this time. I jerked my eyes to the side mirror, half expecting to see something clawing its way out of the trailer. But all I saw was the dark outline of the rig behind me, its taillights glowing faintly in the blackness. Another thump, followed by a low scratching sound like nails on metal. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I was getting out and checking the damn thing. To hell with the lock. Maybe the cargo had shifted. Maybe there was an animal in there. I didn't care. I just needed to know. I pulled over again, this time in the middle of nowhere. The road was surrounded by nothing but fields and distant silos. I climbed out of the cab, the cold night air biting at my skin, and grabbed the key from my pocket. As I approached the back of the trailer, the scratching grew louder, more frantic. Whatever was in there, it was alive. I unlocked the heavy padlock, my heart pounding in my ears, and swung open the doors. The smell hit me first, not the musty smell of old cargo, but something far worse, a stench of decay, like something rotten in the dark. My stomach churned, but I lifted my flashlight and pointed it inside. For a moment, I thought the trailer was empty. But then I saw it. At the far end of the trailer, hunched in the shadows, was a figure. It was humanoid but twisted, like its body had been mangled and warped. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and slick, almost translucent. The thing was huddled against the wall, its back to me, but I could hear it breathing, shallow and rapid. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping back, the beam of my flashlight shaking. The thing turned its face. If you could call it that. It was a mess of raw red flesh, eyes sunken deep to its skull, staring at me with a mix of hunger and desperation. Its mouth opened in a wet, gaping maw, and I heard a low, guttural hiss escape its throat. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My body screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were frozen to the spot. The creature moved, its elongated limbs unfolding as it dragged itself toward me. Each step was punctuated by the sickening sound of its flesh scraping against the metal floor. I didn't think. I just slammed the trailer door shut and fumbled with the lock. My fingers trembled so hard I could barely get it secured. The thing inside let out a shriek. A sound so unnatural, so piercing, it felt like it was burrowing into my skull. I stumbled back to the cab, my legs shaking beneath me, and jumped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For a moment, I just sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell had I just seen? What had they put in my truck? I knew I couldn't stay parked on the side of the road, not with whatever that thing was still inside. I had to move, get away from here. But I also knew I couldn't drive that thing to Salt Lake. No way. Whatever was in the back of my trailer, it wasn't going to make it to its destination. I grabbed the CB mic again, my hand shaking. This is Ben Grady. I hesitated, glancing in the side mirror, half expecting to see the creature clawing its way out. I need help. There's something in my trailer. Static. Then, through the crackling noise, I heard it again. Ben, you need to stop. My voice, clearer this time, like it was coming from right beside me. I slammed the mic down, shifting into gear and pulling back onto the road. I didn't know where I was going anymore. Just away. Away from that thing, away from whatever nightmare I'd gotten myself into. As I sped down the highway, the temperature gauge flickered again, this time dropping into the red. The cab grew colder. My breath was visible in the air, and I could hear the trailer groaning behind me. The thing inside was still moving, still scratching, trying to get out. The radio crackled one last time. Ben, it's too late. I glanced at the dashboard. Every light was blinking. The engine sputtered as the temperature dropped even lower. I could feel the rig slowing, like the weight of the trailer was dragging it down, like whatever was inside was getting heavier by the second. And then the truck stopped dead in the middle of the highway. The engine cut out. The lights flickered before plunging me into complete darkness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The only sound was the soft, steady scratching from the trailer behind me. The door handle rattled. Something pressed against the cab from the outside, its weight heavy enough to rock the truck. I didn't turn. I didn't want to see what was trying to get in, but I knew it wouldn't be long before the door opened. That's the last I remember. When they found me the next morning, the rig was empty. No sign of the trailer. No sign of the cargo. Just me, sitting in the cab, frozen stiff, my breath still fogging in the cold morning air. I never asked what happened to the trailer. Some things are better left locked away.